Kia ora whānau and welcome to Around the Grounds, a podcast from New Zealand Rugby bringing you closer to our national game. There is so much discussion and information around player safety in rugby today, but what can be challenging is understanding all the various terms and acronyms, as well as how that information applies to your level of rugby, your role in the game. It might be a player, a coach, an administrator, a parent, or just someone who loves the game and wants to better understand. So, on Around the Grounds, we're doing a 4-part series with some guests who can hopefully inform our rugby community on all things player safety. On the pod and discussing some often asked questions on concussion are Ken Quarrie, Karen Rasmussen and Janelle Romanchuk. How are you going, team? Welcome.
Hello.
Right, appreciate you all travelling today. I'm glad to hear that all flights are running on time and there's been no issues. I'm about 1 in 4 at the moment, I reckon, with travel issues. But firstly, let's just get straight into it. They're all questions from our rugby community. So, and who wants to take this one? What really is concussion?
Yeah, you bet. I'll jump on this one. So, a concussion can occur from an indirect or a direct blow to the head. So when we say indirect, that might be when you get tackled at the hip or the knee and we see more of that whiplash mechanism. And then a direct would be when you get, a knee to the head, shoulder to the head. And it is an injury to the brain, or known as a mild traumatic brain injury.
Nice, and we hear so many terms and it's all framed up different ways. Like, what's the difference between concussion and sort of how do you say that word? Can you help me?
Neurodegenerative.
There it is. See, that's why I've got you guys here today. But as we said, it often gets framed up. What's the difference between those types of terms and references?
Well, a concussion is an acute injury, so it's something that happens to a player during a practice or a match.
Like a one-off incident almost?
Yeah. And it's typically associated with a range of signs and symptoms that Janelle will be able to work through. But a neurodegenerative disease, neuro means nerves, degenerative means that they're not working as well as they normally do. So if those nerves are in the brain, it could affect thinking or mood or perceptions. If those nerves are through the body, then it can result in changes in the way people move. For example, Parkinson's, you get tremors and so on, or it might change the way people feel.
Sort of more long-term, more chronic is sort of maybe how I'm thinking about it. And also talk a little bit around between concussion and concussion, can we recover fully from that one-off incident versus, the example you gave there is something more long-term and something that hangs around. Like, can we overcome a one-off concussion reasonably quickly?
Yeah, in terms of concussion, as long as, if you think of it as an ankle sprain, as long as you're working through your recovery, you can return from it. From what we know, that having one concussion in a season, you might be at slightly higher risk for having a second concussion that season. So it is really important to take the right steps to ensure that your body and your brain is ready to return when you come back to rugby. But yes, you can recover from a concussion.
So what's the signs and symptoms of concussion, whether it be coaching my young fellas and or whether it be right through to senior club rugby?
Yeah, 100%. So I guess first up, I'll kind of break down what we mean by the signs and symptoms. So signs are something that you might see in a player that you can physically see, and the symptoms are something that a player might feel inside them, or something that they might say to a coach. So when we refer to the signs and symptoms, you're both what you're looking for, but also what you might hear from a player that they might say to you. So signs, they might look disoriented on the field. They might be laying on the ground for a couple more seconds. They might be grabbing their head. Symptoms that they might feel, they might say, I have a bit of a headache. I'm feeling dizzy. I'm feeling more tired than usual. Behavior changes that you might see in them, they might be a bit more, maybe every day they're a pretty happy person. They might be a bit more angry or something than that, or they're a bit more impatient. So we might see behavior changes like that as well.
So those signs, like you say, you can actually pick those up on the field. Someone might have a bit of a loss of balance. They might stay down a little bit longer. Those are things that actually can happen in game. Like you say, you can ask them a few questions around what's going on and what's the score, etc., to assess that. Symptoms can be at the time, but they can be later, like it can be the next day or during the week. They might be a bit more fatigued, and those are sort of things that you can look out for to recognise that maybe that knock they got at footy might be a sign of concussion. Is that right when it comes to those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes they may have had a big blow in a game and they felt okay, but it's when they go back to school on the school or work on the Monday and they're back at their computer or they're back in school and they're like, oh, I'm getting a really big headache from this, that once we've increased that load on the brain, that's when those symptoms come out again. So it is important to keep an eye on them over the next 48 hours because symptoms can come up right after the game up to 48 hours after.
Yeah, right. And who's best to sort of assess that? Like, there's so many people involved in rugby in our community. Like, how do we best assess that to make a good decision around whether we think a player has been concussed at some stage throughout the game?
We like our players to see a doctor. So if they're displaying any of those kinds of symptoms or signs, then ideally they would see a doctor after the game. I know that at community level we don't have doctors like we do in the professional game, but our advice is that person goes to see a medical professional to get a diagnosis, and then they can give guidance on their recovery process after that. Some teams have medics, whether they are trained in first aid or physios, and they can help with that process, but ultimately we want people who are displaying any of those signs and symptoms to get in to see a doctor as soon as they're able to.
Nice. So say this has happened in some way, shape or form, and at some stage we'd like to get back to playing footy. And we hear this sort of term a lot. We hear it when we're watching, on the TV and wondering one of our favourite players is going to be coming back into footy, and we hear it, around our schools and clubs, sort of return to play protocol. What is a return to play protocol?
Yeah. So the return to play protocol is kind of a stepwise protocol to get them. To get their brain functioning well, but also getting them moving well, because the brain, a concussion affects how you move and also how your brain thinks. So what we call the GRTP, or the graduated return to play, there is about 6 steps in it, and when we break it down, when we say graduated, it means you want to work through that first step with no symptoms, and then you can move on to the next step. So it is graduated in that way, and it basically lays out a plan for the player to get back to school and work is the number one thing, but also getting back to play. So if they do have, as they're working through their return to play, if they do have symptoms, they might have to, go back a step, or they might have to repeat a step, and we don't like to put an exact timeline on each step, because each player is different and how they work through that will be different based on how their symptoms are presenting. So it's hard to put a timeline on what an exact return to play for a certain player will be, and it's important that it's really symptom guided.
I like that. So I assume, obviously with a doctor, but then we have some sports physios who are really clued up in the space. We have some coaches and managers and parents who are really clued up in the space, and they'll really help and assist, and like you say, what that return to play might look like, and they might help with some of the timings, and obviously that's really reflective of how a person's feeling. What if you're not sure at all? Like, you're pretty sure as a parent or as a junior coach, a community coach, that a player has been concussed in some way, shape or form, but you're not really sure, how to create a return to play protocol for that person. Like, what would the advice be around perhaps minimum how long they should stand down, or some of the things that you might look for over your players like that? Because particularly kids, but gosh, even our male and female players are pretty keen to get back on the pitch sometimes, aren't they? Particularly if there's a big game around the corner, or there's some sort of goal that you're working towards, and the injury, it isn't. You can run, and you can jump, and you think you're feeling pretty good. Like, what would your advice be for a parent and sort of advising their player or their children in return?
Yeah, so at New Zealand Rugby, we have a 21-day policy in place, a recommendation around concussions. So from the date of injury, it would be a minimum 21 days. And again, that's if they still have symptoms at day 21, it might be a bit longer. New Zealand Rugby and ACC do have guidance on their websites for how you might structure up a return to play. And I would definitely recommend working alongside your healthcare professionals with your physios and doctors that can provide guidance on that.
And I think that's a good point, isn't it? Like there is no shortage of information out there. If you're not sure about something, jump on Dr. Google and like go to the right sites, New Zealand Rugby websites, etc., probably ACC websites, and they will guide you through maybe some really strong recommendations. Look, let's talk a little bit about we're doing this on our own. Like, how do we sort of match up to what's happening in the rest of the world? Because I know, people in your field and profession share a lot of information and try and sort of aggregate that information to get the best outcome. How do we compare with the rest of the world?
So a lot of the world is actually on the same 21-day stand down. World Rugby has actually increased their stand down period. It used to be at 14 days,
12 days.
or 12 days,
Yeah.
And they've now increased it to 21 days. So that happened last year. The UK also has national sport guidelines, which are also 21 days. And Australia has also moved to a 21-day stand down. So internationally, there is a lot of uniformity in terms of minimum stand down guidelines for a concussion. So what's really cool is that we've had these policies in place for about 10 years already. So we've kind of been, leading the way in terms of having that conservative approach and supporting our players.
That's awesome. I've noticed a real change in the community space around from when I used to play to how we all behave now. It really is just a part of the landscape now too. It's amazing how many of our rugby community kind of know these protocols in some way, shape or form, and they put them in place straight away, which is cool. Now, one thing actually, a bit of a question is, when it comes to our teams in black, our high performance teams, All Blacks and Black Ferns, we don't necessarily always see them following a standard 21-day stand down period. Sometimes we might see our favourite player leave the field for a suspected concussion, but then they might be back playing 12 days later or 14 days later, a little bit sooner than the 21-day recommendation. Why is that?
I can jump on that one. So in the professional space, there is a lot more resource. So they have team doctors, team physios that are with the team through the week. So we have those players have access to what we call an advanced level of concussion care, which you don't see in the community game. And so at the professional end of the game, in Super Rugby, for example, our players are part of the head injury assessment protocol, which is set by World Rugby. We have to apply to be able to use it, and we have to meet certain standards. And so there's a whole lot of support around our players, which means that they have a shorter return to play time frame. So in general, it's 12 days. But that's because you've got a doctor and a physio that are there every day monitoring the player, helping them through that return to play process. They have baseline tests, so we look at their baseline level of function, and then when you see your favourite player come off in the middle of the game, they'll be coming off to have an assessment in the medical room, and that assessment's compared to their baseline. They have assessments after the game, and then they have another assessment a couple of days later. So there's a lot more rigour around diagnosing the concussion in the first place and then how they're managed after that. So because of that additional support, that's why the timeframes are shorter than what you'll see in the community game. We're a bit more conservative because you don't have that level of knowledge and support around the players.
Totally, and they know these players, don't they? Like, they have a relationship with them. They see them every day, and sometimes it's not a shorter return; it's a longer return for the same reasons, isn't it? Because they know them really well. And I can attest to some baseline testing at a club level. I'm not very good at balancing on one foot. I can tell you that right now, and I think the physio of our club thought I was constantly struggling. So, but it's good to hear that those sort of practices that they put in place at a high performance level are also starting to filter down with some of our sports physios who are involved in community environments on a more regular basis. Look, everyone has, we're all on sort of in a different time and place on our rugby journey. Some of us played rugby many, many years ago where this wasn't as much of a focus or wasn't as much known about it. If we've got someone, I particularly think this applies to maybe some older senior rugby players, guys who even played golden oldies rugby, like involved in that sort of level of the game. If you feel someone in those environments, maybe has had a concussion of some sort, and perhaps are not going through the steps and processes that we're talking about now, that we're recommending, what would you say to someone like myself to try and help those players understand that, there's a process and to take it seriously?
Imagine if rather than having had a brain injury, you had a wrist injury or an ankle injury, and you've got a fracture, say, you would sit out the 4-6 weeks,
Totally.
whatever. The brain is something that, while it can heal, we need to take care of, because we have our brains right through our life, and we want to be able to think and feel and do all the great things that being a person entails. So if somebody has a concussion at anything below the professional or elite end of the game, you err on the side of caution. If you think that they might have had, sit them out. So that if in doubt, sit them out. Sort of applies, especially down the grades for kids. If you're not sure, get them out of the game until we have had them assessed or they've been assessed by a medical practitioner.
And encourage them to do that, quite often they'll go away, a couple of days later feel okay, but it's still really important to get that initial assessment.
And as in terms of the example you gave for somebody who might be playing senior rugby or golden oldies rugby, a concussion was mentioned as a brain injury. Yep. So the brain's not working as well. So especially afterwards, you need to look after it. So you wouldn't go out drinking, because that affects the way that your brain works as well. And these things can work together to make the symptoms a whole lot worse, and people can end up in dark places pretty quickly. So it's really important to look after your mates. Look out for them. If you see them looking glassy-eyed or a little bit dazed, or they're not making a whole lot of sense, or walking in the wrong direction during games, get them off. Get them off. Get them out of harm's way until they can be assessed.
Look, some clubs are really well resourced. Some schools, clubs, etc. Our community environments, grassroots environments are really well resourced. Some aren't. Sometimes coaches, they're it. They're everything. They're doing the management. They're running the water. Have you got some examples, perhaps from our community of when coaches have got it right? When they've noticed that players are concussed and put some good steps in place.
I think we've done a lot of research over the last number of years trying to understand what are the attitudes and behaviors that, influence players and coaches. And what's really interesting is that a player's reporting behavior or their reporting intention and their concussion behavior is really influenced by the role of the coach.
Right. Yep.
So that can actually start with the start of the season and preseason when the culture that's on the team. So, when you have your early preseason meetings, player welfare is really important, and kind of putting that out to the team early on, that, if you have a suspected knock, like, you have a plan in place on your team, who is that player going to tell? And then what are their next steps to get them, do you have a doctor in the community that you guys normally work with? Things like that. But a player's, reporting intention is strongly influenced by their coach behaviors. So, coach behaviors on the sideline that we want to see is, if a player's had a knock, they're getting them off the field, and they're saying, oh, that's okay, we'll get someone else out there. We don't want to be putting any additional pressure on the player, because they're, players know that things like, if a team is short on players, they definitely feel the pressure to stay on. But New Zealand Rugby has policies in place, such as Game On Rugby, that if we have to drop down to 13 or 12 players for the day, that's the most important thing. So coaches that, if they only have 14 on the day and a player gets injured, they go and talk to the coach and say, oh, is it okay if we drop down to 12 for today? It's having that early communication that's really important.
So it's setting those examples nice and early in the season, and letting the players know that their welfare is front and centre. That's awesome. I love that, and I'm actually seeing that a lot in our community game over the last few seasons, which is awesome. Look, of course, sometimes these issues or our concerns are heightened when it comes to our young people, like our kids and kids at school and all that sort of stuff. I know I coach, the Te Puna under 12 team, and I've got my twin boys who play in it, and all the players' parents are my friends, and so you're not just coaching them, but you're also managing, parents' expectations and trying to set a really good environment for them to thrive in footy. But of course, if a young person gets a knock, we're probably even more concerned about that than we are sometimes in our older people. Like, is junior rugby, ripper rugby, is it safe? Is it different? Like, as you go through the different demographics of a player.
Yeah, I guess I'll kind of pull on 2 points of data that we were able to track this with. So number one is the ACC injury data. So New Zealand Rugby and ACC work closely to understand where are injuries happening across the different levels and what body part are they happening to. So at our, in our small blacks, our under 13, our injury rate is quite low, which is really positive. And the second piece of data that I'll lean to is World Rugby actually does community injury surveillance. So most of that data currently is out of the UK, and they've looked at under 13, under 15, under 16, and under 19. And it's actually the under 13, both the total match injury rate and the concussion injury rate is the lowest out of under 13s, U15, U16s, and under 18s.
That's awesome to hear, because quite often you hear parents say, or rugby community say, at their young age, why don't they all just wear headgear? Like in cricket, they all wear helmets. You have to wear a helmet these days. Like, what do you say to sort of comments like that when people say, let's chuck them in shoulder pads, knee pads, shin pads, and some headgear? Does that make sense, or actually maybe to the point you're making, it's not perhaps as bad as what we think sometimes?
Yeah. That's a really common question that we get, like, why aren't all players wearing headgear? From what we know right now about headgear is that it actually doesn't reduce the risk of concussion. There is ongoing research to try and understand that a bit further. If they use different materials, will that help mitigate the forces? But when we look at a concussion, there's kind of two forces that might act on the brain. So one is what we call linear acceleration, which would be that kind of direct blow. And there's also that rotational acceleration, which would be kind of that whiplash.
Right.
And both of these are present when a concussion injury happens. So if you had headgear, you might be able to reduce the linear acceleration, but the evidence is still evolving on whether it's that linear acceleration or that rotational acceleration that's contributing to a concussion. And each scenario would be different. Which factors are kind of contributing to that overall brain strain. So, there's no evidence right now to suggest that headgear reduces the risk of concussion. And the other factor is the behavior change, the unintended consequences of a player wearing headgear.
Yeah.
Does it make them feel like a superhero and they actually lead with their head a bit more? And there's a lot of behavior change to understand that further. In the future, let's say a scrum cap or a headgear was developed that helped to reduce that risk, but does that actually change the behaviors of the player, and are they being more aggressive, which actually might put them at higher risk then? So there's a lot to untangle in terms of headgear use.
Right. I like it. Well, I suppose that links really nicely to mouthguards. The role of mouthguards. What do they do? Like, we've all got to wear them, and that's absolutely fine. And also, even a second part of that question is just the digital mouthguards, which is, a new initiative and something we're hearing a little bit more about for people who are following rugby on the TV. Like, are they working in terms of identifying HIAs?
They are working. There have been teething issues. I know for round one of Super Rugby, that was the first time this year anyway. We used them in WXV last year in the women's competition. But I think everyone knew what happened in round one of Super Rugby. We had a couple of players coming off. They were very confused. Everyone was confused, including the commentators and the fans. Talk us through.
So they came off because there was a notification from the impact on their mouthguard. That's effectively what happened?
Yeah, so there's a Bluetooth sensor in the mouthguard which then communicates with an iOS device, an iPad that the matchday doctor has on the sideline. And what happened in that first game, or in that first round of Super Rugby, was that there was a delay between the impact that happened on the field and the matchday doctor getting the signal on the iPad to say that there's been an alert over a certain threshold and that player needs to come off for an HIA, a head injury assessment. And so there was a lot of confusion. I think everyone saw Anton coming off the field like this. And so we've looked at the data. They were real alerts, so they were over the threshold. One of the players actually remembered the impact.
Yep.
So that was something. But what we've had to do since that round is we know that wearing the mouthguards is a good thing because it's going to give us a lot of information on how we can protect our players and how we can manage the head injury assessment process in future. So the important thing is that we want the players to wear them, and so we've changed the process a little bit since then while the technology issues are being worked out. So we've been trialling using Bluetooth repeaters on the referee and with the matchday doctor, that then boosts the signal from the mouthguard to the device. And so far we've found that the alerts that we're getting are within about 90 seconds. Right. So then that takes away a lot of that confusion around someone getting an alert and then being asked to come off for an assessment, so there's not as much confusion. So it is working. We're just trying to work these issues out in the background, but we know that it's a good thing and it's going to help us manage our players going forward.
I think it's probably also important to bear in mind why players have mouthguards, to protect the teeth or orofacial injuries. So it's actually their primary role, isn't it?
Yeah, like sometimes there's a bit of an urban myth that it's going to significantly reduce the chance of concussion, but actually as much as anything it's about having a good set of pearly whites, isn't it?
That's right. And in most countries in the world, mouthguards are recommended for use. In New Zealand back in late 90s, early 2000s, we put in a domestic safety law variation mandating their use for all community level rugby. And following that, there was a 41% decrease in dental injury claims from rugby to ACC. Right. So we know these things work. Yeah. And so if you're a young person playing rugby, put your mouthguard on, get used to wearing it every time you're practicing, every time you're playing.
Yeah. So to talk a little bit about that, around that process, like when we nail it, when we get it exactly right and doing all the things we want to do, and it sounds like we're going in the right direction, is it someone may get an impact on the field, that notification is made, they come off, and then it's assessed whether, then they have an HIA from there. So that's when they make a decision around, you can do a normal assessment, they may go back on, they may go off, like that's where we want to get to.
That's right. So there's already a process in place. So we have independent matchday doctors, we have team doctors, team physios who are eyes on the field. So that process has always been there, where they're looking for signs of players being injured or players having a potentially concussive event. So that's still there. But the mouthguards the smart mouthguards are like another set of eyes for the doctors, because we know that sometimes, even with all the cameras and all the medical staff in the world at the game, sometimes you just miss events, and we know that from the HIA data that we've got, that a number of players are presenting after the game with a concussion. So something's happening in the game and they're not being picked up for whatever reason. And so part of the aim of using the mouthguards is to be able to identify those players in the game so that we can get them off earlier, because we know that if they stay on the field, they're at risk of further injury. And that for every 15 minutes that they stay on the field, their return to play time is increased by 3 days. So we want to identify them as early as possible, get them off, and make sure that we can look after them.
Because they're effectively digging into their recovery time. That is time they should be stopped recovering, and like you say, that actually 15 minutes, half an hour can actually mean a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, in terms of how quickly you might be able to get back into playing footy again. That's really interesting.
Right.
Look, there's probably a few myths out there, particularly now it's early days with some of this technology, but if you bite down too hard on your mouthguard, are you going to get pulled off? If I saw someone drop their mouthguard and I was like, he's a good player, I might just stand on that mouthguard, I'd like to get rid of him. These sort of things are probably questions you guys are getting asked. Any comments on that sort of stuff?
I think it was Muliaina talking about biting down hard on the mouthguard in the breakdown. And that is a myth. So if you bite down hard on it, that's not going to trigger an alert. So it's basically a direct impact or indirect impact to your head that triggers an alert. So no matter how hard you bite down on it, that's not going to cause a mouthguard alert and cause you to go off.
Yeah, and I guess just speaking to some of the science behind the mouthguards, there is a lot of signal filtering and processing to help identify cases such as that. That they know, from they've probably a million impacts that they've been able to capture over the last number of years. They've been really able to understand what does an impact look like in rugby, so they can help identify those true events that happen.
What do they call it? A clack when the mouth shuts.
Is that right? There we go.
Yeah. So they're with their kind of filtering algorithm, they're able to identify events of that type. And the one that you said about, yes, stamping on a mouthguard, Karen kind of alluded to this, but there's actually a proximity sensor that's built in to the mouthguard. And each player has a unique proximity value, so they know when it's actually on the player's tooth. So if it's, waving around or getting stomped on, it wouldn't be registering as a...
It's just human nature to try and trick the system, but there's, and I suppose that's awesome. And when it's absolutely, where it needs to be, particularly at that high performance level, it's going to help in training. Because it's going to help, because I assume a training, which is hugely competitive sometimes, and you're really ripping into it, that's not monitored as much. It becomes a bit more of a self-monitoring environment, and there's not necessarily the eyeballs and the cameras and all that thing on. So it'll have a huge role to play in training as well, won't it, to give people a heads up if they've had a knock that needs to be examined a bit more. Yeah,
that's right. So with the smart mouthguards in competitions like Super Rugby, men and women's and above, there is a requirement for players to wear the mouthguard in training as well. So some of the feedback that we've had from our team doctors is that they're starting to understand what that data means now, and they're starting to understand their players, the difference between the types of impacts and the size of the impacts that forwards are having as opposed to some of the backs. And Janelle can probably speak a little more to that.
I don't want to hear, Janelle, that forwards are tougher and backs don't make tackle. I don't want to hear that sort of stuff on this podcast, all right?
So there's a lot of information that we're getting from it that it will be useful in how we manage the players that we're not even touching on yet. So it's a very kind of crude measure at the moment. We're looking at, as Janelle talked about, the linear and that angular acceleration, but also looking at, the mouthguards can also look at the energy of the collision as well, and that's another factor that will be probably built into the alerts in the future.
Look, while we're talking a little bit about maybe myths, but a little bit with injury and insurance, sometimes maybe there's a perception, that if I get injured, am I covered at all? Is it going to put me out of my job or other parts of life? What does it look like for someone in the community game who gets injured, not just their ability to get back playing, but other aspects of their life as well?
I suppose, like any injury in New Zealand, ACC cover injuries as a result of an accident, so concussions are no different. So if someone has a concussion, then we encourage them to go and see their doctor. The doctor can then lodge an ACC claim for that person, and then under the ACC system it means that their treatment and entitlements that they need for that injury will be covered in a financial sense by ACC. So it's just like any other injury that you would have, and that treatment that you need, doctors, physios, whatever it is, are covered from a financial perspective by the ACC system. So we're very lucky in New Zealand in that sense.
Just like when I pull my hammy, I fill out my form, the physio sends it, and then I go through a process with my physio, which is then covered by the ACC. And so it almost makes it even more important when you have a suspected concussion or concussion to get that assessed straight away, isn't it? So that you're getting that ball rolling, you're getting back playing, and you're getting back doing all the things you need to do, and it's covered.
That's right.
Well.
Yeah.
Look, let's talk a little bit about the blue card, the famous blue card. I hear that we've initiated it. Is that true? I even have vicious rumours circulating that my brother was the first blue card. He's claiming it, but perhaps it wasn't in Christchurch, perhaps it was in Northland. But what is the blue card? How does it help player safety? I actually have never played a game of rugby where there's been one, so I'm really interested to hear what the blue card is and the role it plays.
Yeah, so the blue card was, you're right, it was introduced in New Zealand first. There is a number of other unions around the world that have now adopted the blue card for rugby. So it was first introduced in, I believe it was Northland Rugby Union. And so what it is that if a referee or perhaps a medical personnel witnesses a suspected concussion during a community rugby game, the referee would issue a blue card. And what that means is that it kind of goes through a bit of a formal process, and it's just to recognize a concussion. So the referee would issue it, and within that, their medical visits are covered under the blue card. And they would, go through what's required is that the player does get a diagnosis and their medical clearance, and those visits are covered under the blue card. And it's been rolled out in across New Zealand for a number of years now. So.
I like it. So it's basically giving the referee a bit of agency because he's best seat in the house, he's right in the middle. That if he or she sees what he suspects as a knock, can give the blue card and encourage that player to go off and then begin that process of assessment. I really like that because it is literally the best seat in the house. We talked a little bit around, we're talking about concussion, the definitions of it, some of the things around it, but want to prevent it as well, I suppose. So do you guys have some thoughts, feelings and emotions around good best tackling drills, particularly for our community coaches, like how we should be teaching the skill, why we're teaching the skill a certain way. I've still got some shockingly bad habits of tackling a little bit too high that were built up over the years, but we're trying to change that, with my kids and their teammates to make sure that they do it better than dad is always the advice,
Yeah, 100%. I'll jump in here about some of the what we kind of teach at the community level. So through the Rugby Smart program and through our coaches, we really focus on the 3 C's for coaching both the tackler and the ball carrier. So that first C is confidence, building their confidence to go into a tackle. Then it's competence, and then competition. So that confidence, particularly for a new player that's entering the game, and we know for our females, they might be entering at different stages. Totally. So it's actually the confidence in contacting the ground, getting their body used to falling. So you can introduce that through a number of different ways, through games like knee tag. So you're just getting their confidence up about being low. They could be doing roly-polies on the ground, just getting them used to their body actually contacting the ground and contacting another person. And then we'd kind of build that up. So really good to, you can break it down into smaller steps. I'm sure we've all learned the cheek to cheek.
Oh yeah.
The basics that are really driven through the Rugby Smart course about, getting that good leg drive, a good wrap, really focusing on that good head positioning when you're coaching a tackle. So you'd work through that, that competence level, and you can build it up from, starting from the knees. So there's kind of lower energy entering the tackle. Then you can go into a small grid of walking tackles or something like that. And then once they're showing competence at that level, we want to bring in competition. So that we're getting, the factors that are there on game day. Because if they're always doing a really controlled tackle in a training, some of the factors that are there on game day. So we want to bring in that competition, and you're able to reward good tackle behaviors.
A question too, this is a genuine question for me as a community coach, how much contact should we be integrating into our trainings? There's there'll be weeks where I feel we need to do the whole session on tackling, to be honest, because we've had a tough day at the office on the Saturday. But what's advice for community coaches around how much we do, ball skills, vision, decision versus contact versus tackling versus cleaning out drills versus hitting the pads versus bodies on bodies? Is there any sort of guidance or that you guys give for maybe within an hour session if someone's having one 1 hour session a week or one 90-minute session a week or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess with some of the community research that's been going on the last couple of years, that's something that we're really trying to understand is what does training load look like? Because we've actually implemented some of these mouth guards at the community level. So we've got, I think it's 180 trainings across the community level to understand what drills are actually contributing to more overall load for a player. But in terms of when you look at tackle competency, you don't always have to be going full noise at a training session. There's a lot of other micro skills and drills. If you can tell, Saturday everyone was tackling really high. You don't have to be going full noise, on the Tuesday at training. Maybe they just need to be focusing on dropping their shoulder. So you could just be doing
more technical stuff.
Really more technical stuff to help refine those skills. So you don't always have to be going full noise. But there's other, we can take the technical aspect to get those skills going the way we want.
The points that you both made, one is that there are different levels at which prevention works. So managing the total amount of contact is one thing, and then developing the skills. But those skills, because tackling's so dynamic, that's something that people can continue to work on right through their careers.
Yep.
So just like the top tennis players are always practicing their serves, we now see the professional players working on just making sure that they are reading space well, that they're getting into the right position, even though they're under time pressure, getting their bodies into the right position. Sometimes they get it wrong. We see now that there are greater sanctions associated with tackles getting it wrong. So again, try to minimise that chance of being concussed in any given tackle. But that is a real thing now, where instead of being told go low and hard or be aggressive, you're actually being taught right through your career, is the idea that you're going to achieve mastery or some sort of real competence in this skill. And it's a different way of thinking about it. So.
Totally. Some of the great coaches, don't they? They talk a little bit about, what's the target, watching the target, tackle height, all being actually quite specific in the things that you're telling your players, isn't it? That's awesome. Look, you guys are heavily involved in rugby and live and breathe it. Like, do the benefits of playing rugby outweigh the risks? You deal a lot in the risks, but I'm sure you see the good stuff as well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Rugby is a contact sport, and so it does carry risks.
Totally.
And we're trying to understand as well as we can what those risks are. So, for example, we know that very occasionally players sustain serious neck injuries, and players have been permanently paralysed or disabled for the rest of their lives. And I don't think anyone plays sport going into it thinking this could happen for us. But those are very, very rare events. And now, more recently, people have been concerned that, hey, if we're exposing ourselves to contact and tackles, are we putting ourselves at higher risk for neurodegenerative diseases or dementia or conditions like that later in life? And so there's a lot of work going on to understand, are those things, are people at higher risk later, or are they at about the same? So we're doing a lot of research on that, capitalising on some of the information we have in this country with all of our integrated data sets, to try and find out the answers to those questions. But my take on it at the moment is that playing community level rugby contains greater benefits than it does risks overall. So I think players will be at slightly higher risk of neurodegenerative disease, especially if they play at a high level for a long time, and that's sort of offset with lower risks of things like respiratory diseases and metabolic conditions like diabetes and so on. So it's a dynamic space. We're trying to find out more, and we're trying to manage the risks. We're not waiting for all the answers to come back so we're absolutely sure. We're managing the risks, erring on the side of caution. So that's why we're trying to reduce the amount of contact and trainings and change the tackle laws and so on, because we're concerned, we're not sure, but this is the right thing to do.
And just adding to what Ken said, just around the benefits, we know that there are benefits in terms of the social side of it, mental health and well-being, having a sense of purpose, being part of a community and like-minded people, developing like lifelong friendships and those sorts of things. So we know that there are all these benefits, these good things that you get out of being involved in and around rugby. And so it's sort of weighing up those benefits with the risks, that Ken's talked about. And it's our job, the three of us plus the others at NZR, to try and manage the risks and prevent them so that people can get out and just enjoy the benefits as much as possible.
I love that. I suppose that leads in nicely to the last question for this pod, is it sounds like you are forever working on this. Like, there is always research going on. You've sort of touched on this a little bit, but kind of the skill is to apply the learnings in a really dynamic environment so that it's all happening in real time, isn't it? Like, do you guys have just numerous things, pieces of research, when it comes to concussion going on at any one point in a rugby season? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. We do, and it's at various levels of the game too. So I guess Janelle is involved on the community side a lot more. We do stuff in the professional side of the game. So we actually trialled the mouthguards last year in Super Rugby. We worked with World Rugby on some research projects in concussion in the Farapama Cup last year. So there's always things going on. Ken's doing research, which you can talk about, and I think it's part of this podcast later on the long-term effects of playing rugby. So there's research happening, I guess, at all levels in all different areas of this brain health space.
Yeah, and I mean, as you mentioned, we're involved in rugby. We are rugby people, and so we care about the people involved, and that's why we're trying to do it. So I think there are benefits involved in being involved in rugby, and socially as well as physically, and that emotional connection that we have. But we do need to understand the risks so that we can manage them properly. You can't manage risks if you don't know what they are. So.
Thank you, team. Awesome pod. I really appreciate it. And thank you for listening to Around the Grounds. A huge thank you to our rugby community, which makes our national game so special. Thank you, team. Really appreciate it.